We shall get our city back.
We are talking Major Grom, Plague Doctor, or at least this is the English translation of this Russian action comedy superhero movie. This is actually based on an actual comic book by Bubble Comics, and at first glance you might think this is a Russian version of Batman. But in actual fact, this movie has more along the lines of V for Vendetta, I would say, is its main source of inspiration. But also I would say the comic by Mark Millar, Nemesis, is also a kind of comparable piece, although that one has yet to be made into a kind of a live action series or movie. I'd also say it has a little bit of influence from the recent Joker movie. So what is the story? So the story focuses on Major Grom, who is a maverick police detective, but he is the main reason why the police force is so effective in this particular precinct. A very, very effective police, albeit he is a little bit of a maverick and works outside maybe the normal rules. Constantly kind of getting in trouble with the captain, etc. But you can't argue with his results. And he comes across a masked vigilante called the Plague Doctor, who has decided he is going to kind of rid the kind of society of who he deems as criminals, and primarily that entails high-profile criminals who have maybe escaped the law due to wealth. And this initially gets him a wave of kind of popularity from the lower classes in the kind of the community, who see him as a kind of folk hero, almost like a little bit like kind of Robin Hood. But as the movie progresses, he gets more and more violent and psychotic and maybe crosses a few lines here and there. And of course, the super cop must then face the super vigilante / criminal. What will happen? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie to find out. So, let's talk about what works with this movie. Now, I've reviewed a few Russian horror movies and science fiction movies, and the ones that I've reviewed, I would say, have always seemed to have had a pretty good level of production value, and that is true of this movie. In actual fact, I would say this is a very, very impressive movie, kind of comparable to I would say, maybe lower tier kind of blockbuster films in actual fact. I mean, you've got loads of different locations, loads of extras, lots of kind of different kind of set pieces, special effects, costuming, fight sequences, chases, all that kind of stuff. It's all here on screen, and it looks well produced and, well filmed and everything. I'm going to say as well, the movie's director has some stylistic touches that I really kind of appreciated and kind of add to that comic book aesthetic here. And there's some really nice use of different camera angles and camera tricks to kind of make it visually interesting. The characters are very well defined. In actual fact, this, as I said, this is the first time I've really seen any type of humour in the kind of the Russian movies that I've reviewed on the channel. I'm not saying, of course, there's no Russian comedies, but certainly they tend to be a little bit more serious than movies on from the West here. But this one plays a lot more like a kind of a Western kind of action comedy complete with comedy, psychic, and a few kind of gags here and there. But it makes the kind of the protagonists and the kind of the characters within this movie obviously seem quite likeable at times, very personable, and very defined. We have the very defined characters. But put up in that, I am going to come back to some of the kind of characteristics here. I think kind of the idea with the plot is, although it's nothing groundbreaking in regards to where the story goes, and it certainly, as I've mentioned, has influences from other comic media, nonetheless it still has quite an interesting kind of arc and even a little twist within the movie as well. But overall, it's a pretty exciting and enjoyable film. What doesn't work for me? I think maybe this movie is a little bit overlong. Now, having watched a few Russian films, I can tell you they do tend to be a little bit on the longer side. Whilst the average movie you might say that comes out from America or England is probably going to be about 90 minutes. Obviously, there are exceptions, but they tend to be a kind of, 90 minutes, that sort of thing, 100 minutes. This one is just over 2 hours, so about 2 hours, 10 minutes. And it just feels a little bit long. You know, you think this sequence could have been cut out, make it a little bit more punchy. Now, obviously this coming from Russia, and this, having watched a few Russian films now, it tends to be the case. So that this tends to be the Russian style of filmmaking. So I can't really critique it too much for that, because that's just the way they do it seems. We're just kind of used to maybe movies being a little shorter. I think for me, the main critique I would say with this film is the character work. And as fun as some of the characters are, they're very broad stereotypes. For example, Major Grom, who is our central protagonist, is completely altruistic, completely kind of selfless. And, you know, he's like the typical kind of maverick good guy who has no real flaws outside of the things that the society have put upon him. You know, he doesn't trust people, but you know, he'll buy a burrito at the kind of the local kind of like food kind of store, then give it to the dog and things like this. So we see him as a very, very, you know, altruistic good guy, very kind of black and white. Of course, we've got the comedy sidekick who is, you know, the kind of like the weedy kind of character. We've kind of got the sassy red-headed girlfriend. And, you know, all that type of thing. Very kind of broad stereotypes in regards to the characters. So although this movie is certainly well produced, it certainly isn't particularly kind of nuanced in its kind of in its characters. They do seem more like characters maybe pulled from the 90s that we would have had there, where they're kind of maybe not quite as complex as I think maybe audiences would expect from today. I do think sometimes as well the film has these artistic ideas that I don't know if translate particularly well to the screen. So, for example, Major Grom, who is our kind of character or protagonist, has these almost like premonitions where, if you've ever seen the Sherlock Holmes movies with Robert Downey Jr., how he kind of works things out in his mind. We see a visual representation of that. So when he's doing a case, he'll have all these kind of like think about things, and they'll play out in his mind, and we'll sort of see them as they play out. And initially, when I saw that, I thought, "What is this? Is this like a time loop?" The way it was kind of put on screen, I don't think made it obvious what was kind of going on. I think, is this some sort of time loop movie? Has he got kind of these superpowers? I really didn't know what was kind of going on. Now, I'll put an asterisk in there to say that may well be a little bit lost in translation, because this obviously is a Russian movie and the version I saw was dubbed. But nonetheless, I found it a little confusing, first of all. And also, narratively, as the film goes on, you know, the way the film depicts it is like he's thinking about these things in real time and playing them out. But, you know, if we're doing that, what's everyone else doing within those kind of time periods? It's almost like they're sort of frozen while he's waiting to have these kind of scenarios kind of played out in his head. So it doesn't really work in a kind of a narrative context. I mean, that might sound like a kind of a minor thing, but it's the kind of like the unique selling point, so to speak, of our character as he works all this sort of stuff out. So I haven't read the original comics, but if that was something on there, I don't know if that's something that translates to the kind of the screen particularly kind of well. And as much as this is like kind of a fun movie, and it does have a little bit of a twist, it still is a little bit predictable, I have to say. And you can kind of see things coming, and when stuff does happen, reveals happen, it's not really going to be too much of a surprise, as it does kind of follow somewhat predictable paths. Albeit, it's a very well-made film with likeable characters. And I think if you are a fan of the sort of superheroes, particularly the ones I've mentioned, Nemesis from Mark Millar, you know, V for Vendetta, although it's not as kind of, I would say, as classic as that film, for example. But it's nonetheless, it's a very watchable film. I enjoyed it. It's well produced and is a fun movie overall. I'll give this one a 7 out of 10. I was kind of toying with an 8, to be fair, but you know, having kind of thought about it, I would give this one a 7, but it's still a good mark. I know I get, you never really give really high marks. This is a 7 for me. Anyway, have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.